Hello there, folks. Nice to see you. My name's Dustin Cormier. This is my video thesis. Today, we're going to be talking about the prosperity versus annihilation of a house, particularly chapter 11 of Brihat Parashara Horashastra. It's the big, epic tome that outlines most of the principles that we use in Vedic Jyotish. Particularly today, prosperity and annihilation, or the judgment of a house, comes through chapter 11. And that is going to be the main focus of our discussion today. I'm just going to see that you guys can see me here. Good. Okay. Parashara versus Jaimini. Chapters 8 and 11 of Brihat Parashara, or Shastra. These chapters represent deep roots in both the Parashara and Jaimini systems of astrology. You might have heard that Parashara and Jaimini are two different branches of Vedic Jyotish. Parashara, it seems to be the older and the senior of the situation. Parashara had a successor or perhaps a contemporary. A lot of people think that these two knew each other. So Parashara had a successor, perhaps a contemporary, named Jaimini, who propounded more deeply on the figures given in these two important chapters, chapter 8 and 11, along with others, most poignantly chapters 29 to 33, after Parashara. So we can see that Jaimini really expounded on 29 to 33, and as well as chapters 8 and 11. These are the crux of Jaimini astrology. And it's interesting that the guts of Jaimini is found in the work of Parashara. Now, a good astrologer ought to understand the differences between Parashara and Jaimini and eventually marry them, seeing them as two different dimensions of the same chart, of the same soul of the person whose chart we're looking at. And Parashara and Jaimini systems must be seen to work through each other. Welcome to the knowledge of the longest ongoing marriage ever recorded in Indian history. Parashara is to Plato what Westerners recognize. Parashara is to Plato what Jaimini is to Aristotle. Aristotle perfected the works of Plato in a way, but Plato is still important to anyone who wants to get into Greek philosophy. In the same way, Parashara is the senior, and Jaimini took and integrated his own system out of the bones of Parashara. It's good to understand Parashara fully, perhaps even first, since Parashara is the predecessor of Jaimini. You can get along initially as an astrologer without Jaimini sutras, although you'll be missing out on many key secrets without this other branch of understanding. When learning a science like astrology, you have to pit various schools of thought against each other in a reading. My recommendation for you, as students of Asheville Vedic Astrology, is to keep your apples apples and to keep your oranges oranges. Learn Parashara first as fully as you can through Asheville Vedic Astrology's course, and that's essentially what our school focuses on. Afterwards, and even during and in between, you can brush up. I knew some people in my classes who also were taking Jaimini as well, and it was very good for them. They had the time to really study both of these at the same time. Ernst Wilhelm has some great courses on Jaimini astrology. But for now, as an Asheville Vedic Astrology student, focus on what is given in our course, which tends to be more about Parashara. Now, the exception is that chapter 8 and 11 is this is chapter 8 and 11 of Brihat Parashara, or Shastra. It's Parashara's great text. Chapter 8 and 11, Jaimini took these two chapters and really flew into his own thing with them. But these two chapters take high priority in the sequence of things Parashara talks about in his Horashastra. So this is kind of like the link between these two, is chapter 8 and 11. So even though Jaimini perfected a whole new system of astrology by expanding on the logic found in chapter 8 and 11, as well as others, the knowledge is originally an important foundation of Parashara's system. You're going to see as you come along the nature of this divide of these two systems. Just checking here. So you're going to see this divide as you come along. For now, I encourage you to learn the rules of these particular subjects. It's chapter 8, which is rashi aspects. That's the bones of all of this. And then the prosperity versus annihilation of the houses. That's the main theme of our subject today. Learn the rashi aspects and the judgment of the houses thoroughly, because they are fundamental to Parashara astrology. And these are really a key foundation of all astrological practice. They may feel frustratingly different to most people who are used to dealing with angle-based graha aspects. It's trines, oppositions, etc., especially to Western astrologers, as we're going to mention. But Parashara didn't make these a high priority in his teaching sequence for no reason. Chapter 8 and 11 are very early in the text. Now, as you learn Jyotish, and as you get into the actual texts and scriptures, you'll notice that knowledge expounded by a rishi typically proceeds in an ontological sequence, where the first bit of knowledge given takes precedence over the others. That's why the first parts of the book tend to be primary and fundamental. Now, chapter 8 and 11, these two chapters are given out of a total of 98 chapters. And this is according to R. Senthanam, he's the guy who I will often use his translation of the Brihat Parashara Horashastra. Now, other translators, such as N.N.K. Rao and C.G. Rajan, other people organize the chapters differently. But these shlokas, these verses that are found in the judgment of the houses, as well as the rashi aspects, these always take priority in the expounding of Brihat Parashara Horashastra. And they always take priority, they come first. And so these represent deep roots which needed to be abided by prior to all things considered ahead of them in sequence. So this is just often how Sanskrit works, is that they will put the most important stuff first. And this is very early in the sequence, these two chapters. Now, Parashara, in this chapter 11, the judgment of a house, Parashara alludes to certain avashtas, or planetary states, and he doesn't exactly explain them right away. We are going to explain what they are, what their background is in this video. So, Parashara mentions certain key figures in chapter 11, and then he doesn't explain them right away. He returns to them in chapter 45 and explains what exactly these avashtas mean, especially in relation to Lajatadi avashtas, which are not introduced until chapter 45. The Lajatadi avashtas, Ernst Wilhelm considers them to be very, very important when it comes to yoga strength, when it comes to the capacity for a planet to express its agenda. But it's an intermediate technique that we're not going to get into in this video. But the avashtas, which are used in chapter 11, are explained, they're used in chapter 11 and because he wanted to speak to the prosperity versus annihilation of a house in high priority sequence, knowing that the conditions given in chapter 11 could ruin or glorify all the factors spoken of afterward. And that includes the Bhava Yogas come later, the Raj Yogas come later, and they can be ruined if there is annihilation, as given in chapter 11. So, he gave us the bones of what chapter 11, of the bones of the judgment of a house, and then said, I could talk about the different types of avashtas right now, but instead I have bigger fish to fry. And that's why he talks about them later. So the reason is because the avashtas themselves as a whole are not as important as everything that comes before them. You know, there's 45 whole chapters before we get to the avashtas. So the avashtas themselves, they are still important. But This special chapter 11, the judgment of the houses, was put early in the sequence for a reason. And this is the central subject of today's lesson. So this is just a little bit of a breakdown of Brihat Parashara Horashastra's chapters. The first 3 chapters are just sort of cosmological in nature. Then in chapter 4, it talks about the zodiac signs. It goes into special ascendants. It talks about the divisions, the Vargas, which just goes to show how important the Vargas are. Then we get to chapter 8, which talks about the aspects of the signs, not the evaluation of graha aspects, which, note, the graha aspects come much later. That's trines, that's, the special aspects of Mars and Saturn. Those are considered after these more important subjects, and it's the aspects of the signs. That is what separates, really, what most people consider separates Jaimini from Parashara. Parashara technically contains it all, but Parashara really includes and really talks a lot about graha aspects. Jaimini has made a whole astrology out of aspects of the signs, the rashis, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Chapter 8 is the aspects of signs. Chapter 9 and 10 talk about evils at birth and their antidotes. And then chapter 11 talks about the judgment of houses. That's what we call prosperity versus annihilation. Then Parashara gives the effects of the houses. Then he gives the effects of the Bhava lords in the houses. That's the Bhava yogas. So for example, if you're in Aries, first lord is Mars. What happens if the first lord Mars is in the 6th house of Virgo? That'll be a certain Bhava yoga. So all of this, evaluation of graha aspects, Shadbala, all of this comes after, is calculated after these more primary bones, the rashi aspects and the judgment of the houses. So let's get into chapter 8 first of all. Jaimini astrology starts first and foremost with the concept of rashi aspects. And this is a vital dimension of astrology to get in touch with. Every movable sign, and that's the cardinal signs as the Western people would call it, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. Every movable sign aspects 3 fixed signs, excluding the one adjacent to it. And all of the planets that are inside Aries, therefore, will aspect all of the fixed signs, excluding the one adjacent to it. So if there's a planet, if Mars is in Aries, that Mars is going to afflict its nature upon Aquarius, Scorpio, and Leo, but not Taurus, because Taurus is right beside it. Now, imagine that Mars is in Cancer. That means it affects all the other fixed signs except for the one beside it, Taurus, Aquarius, and Scorpio, but not Leo. If a planet is in Libra, it's the same thing. It affects all the fixed signs except the one adjacent to it. Same thing with Capricorn. A planet in Capricorn, like Mars, will affect, with its energy, its malefic energy, all the fixed signs except for Aquarius, which is adjacent to it. I'm making a note here that this is one of the reasons why many astrologers prefer the southern chart style. Jaimini astrologers really find it's useful to use the southern chart because it doesn't change. The northern chart is the one with the diamond, and you turn everything to fit the lagna. Southern astrologers, Jaimini astrologers tend to like the southern chart when using and just thinking about rashi aspects. Now, the fixed signs basically have the same logic applied to, the fixed sign. So if that, every fixed sign, as well as the planets within it, lend its aspect to the 3 movable or cardinal signs, excluding the one adjacent to it. So if we have Mars in Taurus, that Mars is going to affect Cancer and all the planets in it. It's going to affect Libra and all the planets in it, as well as Libra as a house. And it's going to affect Capricorn as a house. This is mostly relevant to the strength of the houses. If we have Venus in the sign of Leo, then it is going to be giving, let's imagine that this is a Pisces rising. If we have Venus in Leo, then this Venus is going to give great help and benefic energy to the second house of Pisces, which is Aries. It's also going to give it to the 8th house of Pisces, which is Libra, and the 11th house of Pisces, which is Capricorn. Venus in Leo gives these other 3 cardinal signs its benefic energy. It's helping supportive energy, makes things easier on them, helps them do what they need to do, except for the cardinal energy beside it. Same thing for Scorpio. If Venus is in Scorpio, it's helping all the other cardinal signs except for the one beside it. Same thing with Aquarius. Venus in Aquarius helps all the cardinal signs except for Capricorn. And then the common signs are the dual signs. That's Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. These all always aspect each other. So these are kind of easy to sort of figure out. If you have Venus in Gemini, it's going to affect Pisces, Sagittarius, and Virgo. So for this Pisces rising in our example, all of its cardinal houses will be helped if there is a benefic in one of the cardinal or one of the dual signs. And this is always a very good thing. For a Pisces rising, Sagittarius rising, Virgo rising, Venus in any of these signs will aspect each other, and there will therefore be aspecting the cardinal angles, and that's a good thing. Venus in Virgo will aspect the other dual signs. Venus in Sagittarius will aspect the other dual signs. And the same thing with one in Pisces. Now, these rashi aspects, you might not recognize them. They might not seem familiar, especially if you're a Western astrologer coming into Jyotish. Western astrologers are not used to these, but it's an entirely separate science from planetary aspects as you might know them. Now, the deepest truth of astrology comes when you can bridge both of these schools, Jaimini and Parashara, together. It's as if the planets and their aspects between each other are a site, something to do with the site of the psyche logos of the planet, whereas the rashi aspects of Jaimini, these have less to do with the sites of the planets and more to do with the karma of the houses that the planets are holding. The houses, of course, being connected to the rashis. The Jaimini Sutras are exquisite, and their authority even overrides Parashara astrology in some ways, in the same way that Aristotle's logic often trumps Plato's logic, although, not always, if you know what I mean. The logic behind this is that the rashi is the field or soil from which the potentials of the planet are nurtured. And, it's like a master swordsman is not only his skill, if he has enough skill, then he can kind of get through anything. But a real master a master swordsman can get out of anything, even with a crappy sword. If they have a dulled blade, they can still do great work, doing great things. But a master swordsman is that much better when he actually has been taking care of his blades and his swords and has a whole bunch of them on his person. In case he loses one, he's always got more, and they're well refined so that his skill as a swordsman can be amplified. We can see that the Parashara aspects in this way are amplified by the Jaimini aspects. So the rashi aspects, the rashis, are the field, the soil, the karma from which the potentials of the planets are nurtured. It is vital to the potential force and reserves of the planet's agenda as a house lord for the rashi and the house to be well. The Bhava owns the Bhavesha, the house lord, as much as the Bhavesha owns the Bhava, and this is very important, For example, for a Pisces, the 2nd and 9th house is ruled by Mars. Mars rules Aries, which is Pisces' 2nd house. Mars rules Scorpio, which is Pisces' 9th house. And Mars owns these two houses just as much as these two houses own Mars. This means that the potential state of health for a house is going to alter our experience of the planet, especially during its dasha periods. Okay? So, Pisces Lagna, Mars rules the 2nd and 9th house. So during a Mars, the dashas are also an intermediate thing that you're going to be learning about eventually. So don't worry about too much about what that is right now. But a dasha is just an emphasis of Mars things, or it's like an important Mars transit, or any transit upon the 2nd house even. So during the Mars dasha, themes related to the 2nd and 9th house will come about in a person's life. Usually the first will be the 2nd house, and then the 9th house will be after. So even if Mars is well placed, like for example, Mars is exalted in Capricorn, and most people say, oh, Mars is exalted, that must be a good thing, this must be a well-producing Mars. But if the 2nd house does not have good aspects, if it's not stable, if it does not have any benefic aspects, and if it doesn't have any way to vitalize itself through the judgment that we're going to be talking about next, then Mars will have nothing with which to enact its agenda, even though exalted Mars has a strong agenda. Again, exalted Mars is like a master swordsman, but if all of your blades are dulled, then your expediency is going to be decreased and reduced. Now, even a planet in good dignity, by being in a friendly or exalted sign, may still experience difficulty producing the things represented by the houses it owns, because of the state of the house itself. Now, how do we define whether a house is in a good state? This is starting to gear us towards an understanding of the planet as the Bhavesha. You're going to see very clearly what I'm talking about. Now we move on to chapter 11 of Parashara's Brihat Parashara Horashastra, the judgment of a house, prosperity versus annihilation. This is one of the first things we learn about in the Asheville Vedic Astrology apprenticeship program. It's this important concept called prosperity versus annihilation of the house, of the houses. The description of this knowledge comes before the description of planets in the houses, and this even takes priority in the consideration of Bhava Yogas. For example, later on, if anybody has gotten into the Bhava Yogas, you should be watching this and knowing that if a planet is in a certain house, it's either going to express it positively or negatively. One of the ways that you can tell that a planet is expressing its potentials positively in a Bhava Yoga is if its house, as a house lord, is in good condition, and if it has prosperity. Now, as a Western astrologer, at first I was frustrated by these rashi aspects because the rashi aspects are different from how I'm used to conceiving of astrology as a Westerner. So when I first was practicing with Ryan and with Asheville Vedic Astrology, I learned it because it was part of our course. But I really didn't fully understand and integrate it until I started doing charts myself. Ryan, at the 4th year, just, sink or swim. You go out there and you just start doing charts and applying what you've learned. And for whatever reason, it's when I started applying them in charts that I realized just how important the prosperity and annihilation of a house is. Because I saw the truth of my clients having prosperous bhavas or not. Many versions of astrology paint a picture of the planets and their energies as happening to us, as if they were separate forces of karma coming down to us. One of the clear markers of Vedic thought upon Indian astrology is the idea that the planets are in fact ourselves, our own karma from our own actions. Planets are arbiters of our very own lagna, the rising sign. So each graha has its own characteristics. Like Mars is Mars to everybody. Mars has certain characteristics that are just always going to be Mars. But those characteristics express themselves as a limb of the energy field of the lagna. So while Mars is the same to everybody by the nature of Mars, Mars is something different to a Leo rising, who has Mars as its 4th and 9th lord. Mars is something different to Pisces rising, who has Mars as the second and ninth lord. Mars is carrying those houses for those different lagnas. So this is a little picture of a cosmology that I just want you to consider. It's the cosmology from Earth outward. So we start with the lagna. It's us here on Earth. It's our primary karmic lens or filter of pure graha jyotish, the pure light of the planet. Our lagna alters or filters the nature of the planets. The ahamkara of the lagna creates a biased coloration towards the other soul colors and elements. So what do I mean by this? Let's say Mars is a red light. It's pure red. Its nature is pure red light. Now, a Leo rising looks at the redness of Mars through its own orange light. It makes kind of a more orangey red. Now, if you look through glasses that were colored orange, the orange would tint the red different. Now imagine being, for example, like Scorpio or Cancer. Cancer would look through the lens of a blue lens, and then the Mars's light would be purple. So this is just a metaphor for what I'm talking about. The lagna changes the essence of the planet. Now, the second layer of our cosmology then is the Bhavesha, which is the planet as a house lord. The planets are dispositors or lords or rulers of the houses owned by the lagna. So therefore, since the planet owns a house of the lagna, a certain house, for example, for an Aries rising, Mars owns the first and the eighth house. Mars means something to an Aries rising in particular. So Mars is the doorway or limb of an Aries' unconscious means. In the same way, the planets are always a limb of the lagna's desires and means. The planets are being used by the soul that is given in the lagna. The planets have already taken on our karma as bhaveshas or house lords prior to our perceiving them, because they exist in us as we exist in them as reflections of our soul. That's a bit of cosmic poetry that I'm giving you there. And then the next layer is the actual rashis and bhavas out in space. This is the space where the bhaveshas, the grahas, fall. And it's also the bags that the grahas are holding. The knives that are inside the master swordsman's person. Now, the point here is to consider the importance of the planets in their role as bhaveshas, as house ambassadors in the soul path of the lagna. So a sterilized, a lot of astrologies just try to give a clean-cut analysis of the planets in their signs and houses. Mars in the 6th house. It's a common thing to say in like Western astrology, and they only really look at it as what is Mars doing to the 6th house. Even just a clean-cut analysis of Shadbala alone also only paints one dimension of the picture. The houses, as given by the lagna, are the light body connected to our soul that the planets act through. The agenda, action, and nature of every planet is painted some shade or color in the unconscious energy field of the lagna, because that planet rules one or two certain auspicious or inauspicious signs and houses from the lagna. It's the bhavas. So this may seem like I'm going in circles here, but this is the key point of all this. So the nature of the graha is painted by the function it serves the lagna through the houses that it owns. This is the key of this whole thing. The nature of the planet is painted by the function it serves the rising sign, the lagna, through the houses that it owns. So, in more novice astrologies, just putting a planet in a house is good enough. It's not often considered the houses that the planet owns and is therefore being used as a channel for. It's one of the great gifts of Vedic astrology, to see the grahas as direct limbs of the houses they own, i.e. as Bhaveshas. So we can understand this cosmology. It comes from Earth, out into the planets, and then out into the stars. The planets are the intermediaries between Earth and the stars and the houses. So, for example, what does it mean that Mercury rules the 5th house of Aquarius? You know, what does Mercury's position, its avashtas, its dignity, say about the activity of the 5th house? Because if Mercury does not have a good position, then the activity of the 5th house is going to dwindle. And if you've been paying attention to Vedic astrology, eventually you'll learn that this makes Vedic astrology stand out from Western, is that it is the 5th house lord of Aquarius. And therefore, Mercury's position is going to say something about the 5th house of Aquarius, about the ability for the person to have children, to be creative, to be creatively discerning about the path through which they attain their dharma. If Mercury is trash, then the 5th house is trash. It's in this understanding of the grahas as Bhaveshas. It's this understanding of the planets as the limbs of the lagnas, houses, that we can begin to understand and talk about the prosperity versus the annihilation of the houses and their agendas. Because that is essentially what the planets are doing. They are the arbiters of the houses and their agendas.